Now, Çağlar Keyder had his BA in economics in America, Yale University in 1969, graduated in 1969. And again, PhD in economics. He obtained his PhD in 1977 from University of Berkeley. Now you might say, he is an economist. Yes, his economics training is not mathematical economics or neoclassical economics, but political economy, historical economy. So his economics, his study of economics is bordering with sociology. Historical economics and historical sociology are two brothers or two sisters. But Çağlar gradually moved away from economics, although for a time in Middle East Technical University, he was teaching in Department of Economics. But later, when he moved to Boğaziçi, he was a member of Department of Sociology. And when he went to University of New York at Binghamton, SUNY, State University of New York at Binghamton, he was also, together with Wallerstein, he was also in the Department of Sociology. Actually, what he was doing was teaching one semester in Boğaziçi Sociology Department and one semester Bingham Sociology Department. Okay, now this much is enough about his education and his affiliation with various universities. I listed many other universities in addition to SUNY, Binghamton, and Boğaziçi. Okay, one more maybe I have to mention, Koç University. Presently, he retired from Boğaziçi University and he is in the Department of Sociology of Koç University. But he has been teaching in many other universities, and he became director or founder of many sociological or research institutions. Okay, now I have to talk about his books, and one of his books I already started talking, that is State and Class in Turkey. State and Class in Turkey, a study in the capitalist development, a capitalist development. Anyway, in this book, as those of you who take this course from me and hence exposed to this book, Çağlar Keyder, as in his other books and his research, adopts a world, okay, now, an approach which is the world system analysis, capitalist world system. Of course, we are talking about contemporary period and or the last 500 years. Last 500 years, according to Wallerstein and according to Keyder, is emergence of a capitalist system in Northwestern Europe, in Poland, England, and France, and its expansion to the rest of Europe and rest of the world to be a world system. To be a world system encompassing entirety of the globe. So now with globalization, it became a global capitalist world system, a global capitalist world system. So he adopts this approach, and in this book, State and Class in Turkey, he demonstrates how this approach can be used in understanding the societies and states which are incorporated into this expanding world system. As a matter of fact, this world system, as I said, emerged during 16th century and started expanding after Industrial Revolution during 17th and 18th centuries. And it entered into Ottoman Empire with full force, more or less, from the beginning of 19th century. Although earlier it had impacts, for example, in 1700s, 18th century, Ottoman Empire started losing wars with European countries, for example, in Vienna and in other frontiers between Europe and European nation states and Ottoman Empire. But when we come to 1838, when Tanzimat edict was announced, it was actually directly expanding capitalist system dictated its logic or the structural requirements of the capitalist world system's logic for the transformation of Ottoman state, and mostly Ottoman state, and Ottoman economy, and Ottoman society. So from the end of 18th century, but faster and much more deeper during 19th century, continuing of course into 20th century, is first peripheralization of Ottoman Empire, and then development of a underdeveloped capitalist economy or peripheral capitalist economy, and eventually perhaps moving from peripheral to semi-peripheral zone, a semi-peripheral country, eventually acquiring the status of semi-peripheral country. Now, in this book, the first stage is peripheralization, because when Ottoman Empire encountered emerging Western powers, for example, the middle of 16th century, when Sultan Süleyman was the Sultan of Ottoman Empire, the first capitulations actually were given to France, to French, or the origin of the French nation state, the previous empire, and hence gradually Western, first French merchants and eventually British merchants entered into Ottoman Balkans and Ottoman Anatolian coastal lines, and the agricultural goods that are grown in these areas are collected by these merchants and imported to Europe, or they are exported from the point of view of Ottoman merchants. There were also some Ottoman merchants. So at that time, Ottoman Empire is one of the central empires, maybe the empire. When we are talking about 16th century, Europe is peripheral, in a peripheral status, trying to emerge from that peripheral stages, although they are developing from maybe 10th, 11th century onward. When we come to 16th century, okay, they are already developing their absolute state structures, absolute state. The kings emerged and consolidated cellular feudal structures into a centralized state structure, but still, Ottoman Empire was much more centralized and stronger and controlled much larger areas than any comparable European imperial absolute state. So when European powers and Ottoman Empire, Ottoman state encountered each other, the major one, the dominant one, was the Ottoman one. So how this dominant major partner became gradually a minor partner, dominated partner, and European powers became a major and dominating, colonizing partner, or how they become great powers manipulating Ottoman Empire. Now that process is from dominant process to peripheral process. So Çağlar Keyder called this peripheralization. So in first two chapters, he talked about this peripheralization process. And then in third chapter and onward, how Ottoman Empire or the elites in the Ottoman Empire tried to reorganize Ottoman state, as required by the logic of expanding capitalist, world capitalist system, world capitalist economy, and yet how gradually a new state class emerged. Now, Çağlar Keyder thinks that until a period, in all periods, maybe until very recently, until 90s perhaps, the capitalist class, the bourgeois class, the merchant class became subordinate to state class. Okay, now peasantry, of course, they were subordinate. So Çağlar Keyder says that in Ottoman Empire, state bureaucrats and peasantry were two dominant classes. In between them, there was artisanry, traders, merchants. Now, during Ottoman period, these merchants were mostly minority groups within Ottoman Empire, the Christian and Jewish minorities. The merchants, these merchants or these intermediaries between peasantry and Western capitalism, capitalist markets, were these Christian merchants in between capitalist, in between state class and peasantry. Peasantry, or the part of peasantry which started, especially in the coastal areas, goods and hence commodified goods that are exportable. Okay. Now, as friends who had that class will remember, he talks about the Union and Progress Party, and in the turn of 20th century, how they moved further in the transformation of state structures, and how the conflict between intelligentsia, the Ottoman intelligentsia, on the one side, Ottomanists, on the other side, Turkish nationalists, and on the other side, Islamists, three political movements contesting among each other, and with First World War, how Committee of Union and Progress was unable to direct the war, and how they become in the losing side of First World War, and how Ottoman Empire disintegrated as one of the three empires that disintegrated as a result of, or at the end of First World War, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, and Ottoman Empire. Okay, now, as the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, as you know, Istanbul included, Istanbul is occupied, and many other parts of Ottoman lands are occupied. Aegean coast by the Greeks, southern by the French, etc., etc. It was a period from 1918 until the end of 1922, 23. There was this direct occupation by the great powers, by England, France, Italy. Well, Italy also was one of the countries that occupied some parts. But Turkish state class and the army had a leadership that emerged during First World War, as you know from your lycée books. The Dardanelles War, Çanakkale War, between British soldiers from New Zealand, or from England, from all other colonies on one side, and Turkish army on the other. And Mustafa Kemal Pasha, at that time, he was not yet Atatürk. Mustafa Kemal Pasha was one of the commanders on the Turkish side. The British forces were unable to penetrate into Ottoman Empire. That is, they couldn't win the war there. So from that confrontation, Mustafa Kemal Pasha emerged as a charismatic leader, and in 1919, as you know, he left Istanbul, went to Samsun and Erzurum, Amasya, eventually Ankara, as you know, and by 1920, a parliament established in Ankara, and the war of liberation of Turkish lands was successfully carried out with this parliament, with the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, to whom this parliament gave the second name, Mustafa Kemal. Okay, now from that period on, from 1923 to 50, although there are ups and downs, especially after 1929, the great crisis, depression Great Depression. The world capitalist system collapsed, and Turkish state class, according to Çağlar Keyder, used this opportunity to start a development from above, an industrialization which is under the direction of state class, a statist, a statist industrialization and development. In a sense, taking the example of Soviet Union, which at that time, already after 1917 revolution, Bolshevik revolution in Russia, they already started having first 5-year plans, second 5-year plans, and under the direction of the state, there was a socialist development and industrialization there. In Turkey, it was not socialist, it was mixed. It was private enterprise was allowed, but state intervention in the economy was opening the field actually for entrepreneurs that will emerge eventually. So state class carried out this development project. But in the Second World War, and especially after the ending of the war, Turkey should have chosen, as you know, to join the first world versus second world, socialist world, and there's a third world. Now this tripartite division of world took place after the Second World War, and Turkey wanted to join first world, which is led by American hegemony. American emerged out of Second World War as an hegemonic power, and Turkey joined it. And as we discussed when we were discussing Berkes and Boran's eviction from Department of Social Sciences of Ankara University, the students as well as bureaucracy wanted to get rid of these sociologists because they were saying that a socialist type of development will be more rapid and will be to the benefit of the people. Okay, so they were sacked, and Niyazi Berkes went to Canada, Muzaffer Sherif went to America, Beyce Boran stayed in Turkey, but and into politics. Anyway, we know that part of it, 50s. So the transition to multi-party system, and gradually development of a private sector, some merchants moving into industrial sector. Okay, so Çağlar Keyder talks about all these transformations. During 70s though, this type of development model, development paradigm, it says, came to an end from the Turkish point of view because there was a shortage of foreign currency that financed, but that was necessary to finance inputs that are imported. Okay, so there was a crisis, especially in the second half of 1970s, which led to 1980 coup d'etat, military intervention. After military intervention, again a structural adjustment and adapting the Turkish economy and Turkish state to the logic of neo-capitalist reorganization of world capitalist economic system. Okay, now I summarized the whole book. This is enough for that book. Okay. Now, actually, among the books here, there is also a book which is about how, okay, the Turkish of it is The Collapse of National Developmentalism. Actually, the Turkish title of this book is Milli Ulusal Kalkınma Paradigmasının Sonu. I think something like that. The Collapse of National Developmentalism. So the evolution of crisis and alternatives for Turkey is another book, co-authored actually. So all other books, studies in, okay, the definition of a peripheral economy, Turkey from 1923 to 29, this book published in Cambridge is actually is incorporated into that book, State and Class. He has also some comparative studies between economic growth in Britain and France between 1780 and 1940. So, you know, he not only studied Turkey, Ottoman Empire, its peripheralization and development, but other countries as well. But the second field that he, from the beginning actually, he studied is rural transformation, the peasantry, the state class and the peasantry. How that peasantry is being transformed. So, for example, he has a book, The End of Agriculture as We Know It, co-authored actually with Zafer Yenal. And there's an article. That article is actually a summary of this book, The End of Agriculture as We Knew It. Bildiğimiz tarımın sonu Türkçesi. Yani it's published in Turkish as Bildiğimiz tarımın sonu. And also this other book, Studies in Social History. Now, especially in these two books and numerous articles, he talks about the peasantry, okay, the transformation of peasantry. Now, again, coming from the world system approach, and looking at the conjunctive cycles of the world system, the conjunctive cycles of the world system there is a phase of expansion, a phase it is called, of Kondratiev cycle, and then turning of it, a crisis, the starting of a crisis, and coming down of the volume of world commerce, B phase. Now, in accordance with this rise and fall of the cycle of the world system, Turkish peasantry, in the rise period, peasants became more and more autonomous. But in the second phase, this autonomy of small peasants, farmers, is appropriated by emerging landlords or powers, and they become sharecroppers in the second phase. Now, this, he says, continued until 1950s. Now, from 1950s onward, this pendulum development ended, and peasantry continued to have its production commodified, and hence a petit commodity production relationship, not capitalist relationship, but petit commodity production relationship dominated in the Turkish agriculture. So together, okay, here the research that developed a typology of villages in terms of this petty commodity production, where it's dominant and where it is not dominant, what other types of villages there are. We carried out the research together. So it is Bahattin Akşit, Çağlar Keyder research, which we carried in the beginning of 1980s in several villages throughout Turkey. And we found four different types of transformation. One is this middle-sized farmers. We called them with Russian experience before Soviet Revolution, kulak farmers, having tractors and land enough to cultivate cotton or wheat or whatever, a commodity, without hiring any permanent workers, but hiring only seasonal workers in the case of cotton. There are those smaller farmers, again, petty commodity, less productive villages. We call them diversified economic activities. There is some kind of gardening, there is seasonal migration, there is rug weaving, etc., etc. And another type of village is deserted village. Those villages, we found them, for example, in Black Sea, in Çankara. They are almost all residents of the village deserted the village, deserted villages. But now, though, when we went into the villages, there were some old people and retired people who deserted the village. Some of them are coming back, building new urban type of buildings and started living there. And there is also large land ownership and has capitalist farm type of villages where there is a large capitalist farm and where there are permanent wage workers. So four different types. Some of these types I studied earlier than this research and after this research, but during this research together with Keyder, we elaborated on this. Okay, now with this, I think I will stop here